Good afternoon and welcome to our series of webinars focused on bringing you information about COVID-19, infection control, and other nursing home related topics. The information in these weekly webinars is geared toward long-term care and skilled nursing facilities, but we encourage everyone who's interested to attend. My name is Kathy Caudill. I'm a communications specialist with Quality Insights. Today's webinar is Enhanced Barrier Precautions, a follow-up. Everyone has entered the meeting on mute, but we will have a Q&A following the presentation. If you have questions or comments, please submit them using either the chat or the Q&A tool in your Zoom menu. We invite you to join us every Wednesday for more of our weekly webinars. Next week's topic is dialysis and fluid management. If you're interested in joining, that webinar will be the same time and place next Wednesday at 2 p.m. And now I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers today. We have several of our quality improvement specialists: Deborah Wright, Penny Imes, Shirley Sullivan, Patty Austin, and Valerie Wood. And we're also joined by Quality Insights infection preventionist Jennifer Brown and Medical Director Dr. Jean Storm. Today's webinar will be a little bit different. We have a series of scenarios that we will be acting out related to enhanced barrier precautions guidance in nursing homes. Our first scenario features a medical director and nurse. Jean Storm will be playing the medical director, and Jennifer Brown will be playing the nurse. And they decided to come in character today as little avatars. So Jen and Dr. Storm, you can unmute yourselves when you're ready to start.
All right. This resident has a history of urinary tract infection, and the bacteria identified in the culture is MRSA. Please start enhanced barrier precautions on this resident immediately, Nurse Jen.
Dr. Bacteria are not required to implement enhanced barrier precautions on this resident.
Why not? This resident has a history of MRSA, and that's an MDRO.
While enhanced barrier precautions were initially intended for those colonized with or at risk for colonization with novel or targeted MDROs, CDC's updated guidance now provide facilities and jurisdictions the flexibility to implement enhanced barrier precautions for residents colonized or infected with any epidemiologically important MDRO.
Oh, well, for what MDROs are enhanced barrier precautions recommended?
At a minimum, enhanced barrier precautions are intended to be used for residents colonized or infected with novel MDROs. Those are MDROs that are newly introduced or emergent in a locality or region, or MDROs targeted by the CDC. The Enhanced Barrier Precautions Guidance also provides facilities and jurisdictions the flexibility to implement enhanced barrier precautions for residents colonized or infected with additional MDROs that may be epidemiologically important locally.
So what factors do you think we should consider in implementing enhanced barrier precautions for residents colonized with MDROs, which are not targeted by the CDC?
Determinations about an organism being epidemiologically important may be influenced by factors that include local epidemiology, presence of ongoing or past outbreak, propensity for transmission in healthcare facilities, association with severe outcomes, or targeting for local prevention efforts.
Thank you for that information. It's very helpful. Let's hold off on implementing EBP on this resident for now. I will arrange for a meeting with the interdisciplinary team to develop a comprehensive policy on EBP implementation.
Great, that sounds good.
All right, that's the end of scenario one. Our next scenario will feature an assistant director of nursing speaking to a nurse. The ADON is played by Penny Imes and the nurse is played by Deborah Wright.
Hey, Beth, please remember to utilize enhanced barrier precautions when you start the tube feeding for the new resident in room 203.
Are you serious? Do I really need to put all that on? It's not like I'm going to come into contact with any body fluids or blood when I hook up the tube feeding.
Well, I understand that it does seem like a lot, but according to the CDC guidance, Enhanced barrier precautions are recommended for the care and use of a feeding tube. The safest practice is to wear a gown and gloves for any care or use of an indwelling medical device. So that's when you're injecting or infusing medications or tube feeds.
So what else is considered an indwelling medical device?
An indwelling medical device is something that provides a direct pathway for those pathogens that are in the environment to enter the body and cause infection. So some other examples would be central vascular catheters. So those things like PICCs, hemodialysis catheters, are indwelling urinary catheters, feeding tubes, and tracheostomy tubes. Now, there are devices that are fully embedded in the body, such as a pacemaker. They have components that communicate with, they don't have any outside communication, so there's no way for the pathogen to enter. So a pacemaker or any other device fully embedded would not be considered an indication for enhanced barrier precautions.
So if a PIC or a central line is, what about a peripheral IV? What about when we start those?
Well, even though the data is limited, CDC does not currently consider peripheral IVs except for those midline catheters that we sometimes have. So peripheral IVs, continuous glucose monitors, and insulin pumps are currently not considered as indications for enhanced barrier precautions. And an ostomy in a resident without an indwelling medical device would also not be considered an indication for enhanced barrier precautions.
Okay, I'll make sure I follow the guidance. Thanks for all the information.
Thanks a lot, Beth. You're the best.
Okay, our next scenario features a CNA speaking to a nurse. The CNA is played by Shirley Sullivan, and the nurse is played by Jennifer Brown.
Jen, Mrs. Smith has a skin tear on her ankle from scraping the wheelchair, and it looks like the tear needs to be cleaned and a Band-Aid applied.
Okay, I'll do that right now. All right, all set.
Thank you. I'm going to take Mrs. Smith to the restroom now, and I will make sure that I use enhanced barrier precautions.
Well, the skin tear is not a wound. Enhanced barrier precautions do not need to be utilized.
Oh, okay. I'm a little confused. What exactly is considered a wound that requires enhanced barrier precautions?
Well, in the guidance, wound care is included as a high contact resident care activity, and it's generally defined as the care of any skin opening requiring a dressing. However, the intent of enhanced barrier precautions is to focus on residents with higher risk of acquiring an MDRL over a prolonged period of time. This generally includes residents with chronic wounds and not those with shorter lasting wounds, such as skin breaks or skin tears that can be covered with a Band-Aid or similar dressing.
Okay, can you give me some examples of wounds that require enhanced barrier precautions? And what about ostomies?
Sure. Some examples of chronic wounds include, but aren't limited to, pressure ulcers, diabetic foot ulcers, and chronic venous stasis ulcers. Ostomies, like colostomies or ileostomies, are not defined as a wound for enhanced barrier precautions.
Oh, thanks for clearing that up. That was great information.
Sure, anytime.
Okay, and this is our last scenario. This features a physical therapist speaking to a resident. The physical therapist is played by Valerie Wood, and the resident is played by Patty Alston.
Hi, Mrs. Smith. I'll be with you in just a moment. I need to put on a gown and gloves, and then we will start our session.
Hey, wait a minute. Is it because you didn't wash your hands after working with that guy over there?
I did wash my hands after I worked with the last resident, but I do need to use enhanced barrier precautions when working with you.
You know, lunch is right around the corner. I know the nurses have to put all that stuff on, but I didn't think you had to when we're just working together in therapy. Is it maybe because of this dialysis catheter?
It depends on the activity, but therapy can be considered high contact resident care. So therapists should use gowns and gloves when working with residents on enhanced barrier precautions. And that is in the therapy gym or in the residence room if they anticipate prolonged close body contact where transmission of MDROs to the therapist's clothes is possible. So we are just keeping everybody safe, including you.
So you are saying that you have to wear that because I have this dialysis catheter.
Yeah, so the dialysis catheter is an indwelling medical device that provides a direct pathway for pathogens in the environment to get into the body and cause infection. So other examples of the indwelling medical devices can include, but not limited to, central vascular catheters like hemodialysis catheters and PICCs, peripherally inserted central catheters, indwelling urinary catheters, feeding tubes, and tracheostomy tubes. These are devices that are fully embedded in the body without components that communicate with the outside, like pacemakers, wouldn't be considered an indication for enhanced barrier precautions.
Well, I didn't ask for all that information, but I do appreciate you keeping me safe from infections. So why don't you go ahead and get dressed?
Okay.
All right, that was our last skit. In a moment, we'll begin the Q&A portion of this webinar. If you have a question or comment, please submit them using either the chat or the Q&A tool in your Zoom menu. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to request to be unmuted to ask your question out loud. I'd again like to invite everybody to our webinar next week, which will be on dialysis and fluid management. And that will be the same time and place next Wednesday at 2 p.m. We also invite you to bring your questions to our virtual live chats every Tuesday and Thursday at noon. One of our quality improvement specialists will be there to answer your questions on topics such as quality improvement initiatives, infection control, or MDS coding. You can find the links to our live chats and our webinars in the newsletter we send out each Friday called the Last Minute Lowdown. And if you'd like to receive that newsletter but don't think you're on the mailing list, you can email me at ccaudill@qualityinsights.org and I can get you on that list. And I'll drop my email in the chat shortly. I see we already have a couple questions coming in, so let's go ahead and get started. The first one says, does the resident have the right to refuse EBP?
I can take a stab at that. So I will say, just like if you have a resident that refuses medications or you have a resident that refuses dialysis, I personally, like, that is not the end, right? So we have duties as medical providers to make sure that we are meeting the resident where they are, communication wise, making sure they understand what their choice is, making sure what their choice is for the other residents. So of course, I mean, every resident has a right to refusal, but then you may need to alter, the way you do things. But I would certainly make sure the resident fully understands why it is being done. Take the time to make sure that the resident understands what is going on. And maybe in that instance, you bring in the ombudsman, because that is not just the residents' rights, like that's right, involving rights of other residents in the facility. So that might be a reason to bring in the ombudsman.
Yes, and I agree with that. Just like the transmission-based precautions for other pathogens and things like that, you have to consider the overall safety of everyone involved.
All right, thank you, Dr. Storm and Jennifer. Our next question says, would urostomy be included for enhanced barrier precautions? If I said that correctly.
So you did, I can take that one. So while a urostomy is not one of the examples that they give, I do think that you would have a strong say in the fact that you could consider it the same as an ileostomy and a colostomy. I would just make sure that it's one of those examples that you have in your policy and procedure.
All right, thank you, Deb. Next question says, I have a question about the placement of PPE for enhanced barrier precautions. Are they to be available outside the room or inside the room?
I mean, I guess we can maybe, I think probably this is done different ways in facilities. How I've primarily seen it is available inside the room. I don't know, Jen, if you've seen it differently.
Yeah, if you have, PPE that is dedicated for that resident, and you have like a organizer inside the room, sometimes there's a hanger inside. But for general PPE, you can keep it outside, just like you would for any other sort of transmission-based precautions.
Thank you. One person asked, where do I find the list of targeted MDROs from the CDC? And Jen, I was just thinking that this list was one that we had in a resource that we were wanting to share with everybody.
Yes.
Where it was linked out of the resource.
Mhm. Yeah, so the list of targeted MDROs is on the CDC website for enhanced barrier precautions. And we do have a resource available with a list of those targeted MDROs and a link to the website where that's listed.
So I'll share the link for both of those in the chat shortly.
Thank you.
Let's see, the next question. Am I understanding correctly that MRSA is not a targeted MDRO and not one of the MDROs that have to have EBP in place?
So MRSA is not a targeted MDRO from the CDC. However, that's when that epidemiologically important list comes into play, because if you have a history of MRSA in your facility, that's impacting your residents, if it's something that's prevalent in your region, that's when you want to include that in your policy as one that you are using enhanced barrier precautions on. So, that little caveat that they give about the epidemiologically important, that's where that comes in.
All right, I'm getting that CDC link. Let's get to the next question. It says, if we are not accessing the dialysis catheter at the facility and it is covered with a dressing, are we still to use these precautions?
I would say yes, because even though you're not accessing the port, and it is covered by dressing, the area is still being exposed, and if the dressing falls off or is compromised in some way, they will be at high risk. So yes.
I agree. I heard it recently there was a resident who was being showered and the dressing for the dialysis catheter just fell off in the shower. So you can imagine it just puts the resident at risk. So yes, I would use it at all times.
All right, thank you both. And I just found the link to that CDC list, so I just put that in the chat. Let's see, the next question is, I thought keeping PPE inside the room went against best practice recommendations. Why is PPE for EBP different than other isolation?
It's not. You would use the same protocol as you would for any other isolation, unless you have specific PPE that, I guess, a specific procedure to use at your facility. You have a policy for keeping it inside the room. If not, it should be outside in the cart with the rest of the PPE.
There's a couple more comments related to this. One says, we have ours outside the room in a covered cart. Another person asked, was the reply about location of PPE that it could be stored inside the resident's room, like a door hanger like a door hanger on the back of the door is okay?
I would just use, I know I answered what I saw in one facility. I would just do best practices as Jen stated and keep it outside the room unless you have a specific policy for your facility, though outside the room is best practice.
Thank you. A couple more questions coming in. Someone said, maybe this has been addressed, but would precautions be utilized giving IV meds?
So it's going to be dependent on the type of IV. So if it's anything other than a peripheral IV, then yes, you would need to, because they have that device in place.
Thank you, Deb. And this is the last question we have so far. It says, so if someone has an indwelling port, they still need precautions.
If it's a central indwelling port, yes. If it's access to the outside, so like a meta port that is not accessed, you would not need enhanced barrier precautions for that, because the skin is covering, it's an implanted. But if it has any break in the skin to the outside, then yes, you would need enhanced barrier precautions.
All right, thank you. And that's all the questions we have so far. Let's see. Make sure there's nothing else I need to go over. Oh, we just had another question come in. Yes, if anyone else has questions, please submit it at this time. This question says, with MRSA, who would I contact in my local region to see if it was an issue in our region?
So you can talk to your local, county, health department to see if there's any, issue with MRSA in your region, or you can look at your surveillance data within the facility and within the region to see whether or not it's impactful in your area.
Thank you, Jen. And that's the last of the questions that we've received so far. So I would like to ask if anyone else has a question to please go ahead and put it in at this time. And I would like to ask if anyone on our team, on our panel, has anything they'd like to add before we wrap up.
Sure. I just want to point out that if anyone has downloaded or has a copy of the enhanced barrier precaution flowchart that we had put out when we first started doing these webinars, that has been updated. Not too much has changed, but some of the definitions of what is an indwelling device and some of the clarifications. And we've also fixed, when CDC updated all of their websites, all of the links were broken. They still automatically redirected you, but now these links have all been fixed, so you should be able to go right to the site for whatever area that you're looking for on this flow chart. So Kathy's put that in the chat, and it's also on our resource page where you can download that.
Thanks, Deb. And we'll be putting that back in the newsletter again this week. So, and I'll be emailing everybody later this week with links to this recording, and I'll include the link to this resource for downloading. Looks like we got one more question. It says, to the above question, EBP is only used when providing direct close contact care and the resident can come out of their room. EBP is not like contact or droplet precautions.
That's correct. I'm not sure if Melinda, if you're just clarifying, like justifying that, but that is correct.
Thank you.
I just wanted to share that it just related to this topic. I did a podcast that will be released this Friday with Jen Brown, our infection preventionist, and another individual, Gina Yakenchik. I think she's actually on today. It was interviewed because they were, Jen produced and developed the infection preventionist boot camp, leadership boot camp that has been a huge success, and Gina talked about her experience with the boot camp. So if anyone is interested in learning about the boot camp and you just want to listen to it on the podcast, that will be released on Friday.
Thank you, Dr. Storm. And I'll have that in the newsletter this Friday as well. And if it's online by Friday morning, I'll have that in that email that I sent to everybody too. And I believe that's it for questions. So I think I can wrap us up. Does anyone on the panel have anything else to add before I close out? We got one more question that slipped in last second. It says, is housekeeping to be wearing EBP?
Yes, if they're going to be doing any, resident contact, they would be included in that as well.
All right, thank you, Jen. And if we didn't get anyone's questions today, of course, you can email any of us here. You can email me at ccaudil@qualityinsights.org, and I can get your email forwarded to someone who can assist you. All right, and actually, I don't think.
Just one more note about that. Like, so, by like resident contact, like linen changes and things like that, where, they might come in contact with, anything from the resident, that would be included in it.
Oh, we got one more. It says, did you see this part, Jen? It says, so if they're cleaning and the resident is not in the room.
No, they would use more so the standard precautions based on your facility policy. But if there's any high contact, like I said, activity, that they should use PPE to do that.
All right, thank you, Jen, and thank everybody for your questions. I will go ahead and close this out. I put my email in the chat, so if anyone needs to get in touch, if they need a resource or want to get in contact with anyone on our panel, you can email me and I'll put you in touch. Before we sign off, we'd like to ask everyone here to please answer a short evaluation of today's webinar. It is anonymous and will show as a pop-up as soon as the webinar ends. So if you have a couple minutes to fill that out, we would appreciate it. I'd like to thank our whole team for joining us today and for your amazing acting. And I'd like to thank everybody who joined our webinar today, and we hope to see you again soon.